There's someone very special we'd like you to meet. She's a survivor of pedophilia, torture, and sex trafficking. More than that, though, she's a healer, a doctor of psychology specializing in trauma recovery. Some of what you will learn today, unless you have experienced it, will be difficult to comprehend and even believe, but traumas like Max's happen all around the world to many girls and boys. And while these experiences are part of Max's story, they aren't who she is. Max is not just here to share some of her story, she's going to be the host of UNN's Meet Max series. This series will feature guests from all walks of life with their own survivor stories. Stories of hope, help, and sheer will. You're not alone. You don't have to face your experiences alone. It's time you meet Max.
Hi, Max. How are you?
I am a little nervous. I do not like to be in the spotlight, and being on camera is a little triggering for me. I was studied and, watched, and so it's taking a little bit of a push to do this, but I have heard, sometimes I hear from source, and I have heard that it is, I am to do this series, for one. And, when I first did the intro, which is up on UNN, I had to do it a few times because the first few times I looked so scared.
Right.
And so what I heard from sources, it's okay. The very thing that was used against you, you will take and you will transform it and you will use it for good. And that's something that I have done my whole life with everything, so that makes sense to me. And so I'm here. And
well, now when we were talking earlier, you mentioned about having memories of volunteering for this lifetime.
Yeah. I had some memories, I guess, of when I wasn't here on this planet. And what I remember is being in some kind of a meeting with other beings that were not necessarily human, and all of us talking about planet Earth. And I I scouted, so I don't know what I did, but I was suddenly watching in a timeline, and it was pretty awful. Everything was destroyed. So suddenly I was back in the meeting, and the last thing I remember is raising my hand and saying, I volunteer to go.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what did you see your role was going to be as you came into this existence and in this role?
Well, when I was a little girl, I still retained some of my memory, and so I knew that I was here as part of a larger group to help basically transition this planet from the darkness that it is and has been to something more light and what I think it was originally intended to be. Yeah, so I remember being, very small, maybe 2 or 3, and being struck by the brutality here. The darkness, the denseness, I was pretty shocked. So I guess wherever I came from, which I don't remember exactly, but I have a memory of it being completely something else. So this kind of level doesn't even exist wherever I came from. And I had a sense, even as a little girl, that I was here on a mission. And I had, when I was living in Lesotho in Africa, I was about 5, and I was laying on the ground at night watching the night sky. And suddenly I saw this image of all these stars shooting down, landing all over the planet. And in that moment, I had this knowing that, so that all of us, a big group of us have come from wherever, and we've landed on all different parts of the earth. And what I knew is someday I will find those people, and I will work together with those people. And frankly, that is something that sustained me in my darkest moments, is that knowing that I was to remain alive until I found that group.
Now, you seem to have taken in a lot of darkness.
I did.
But you seem to put out a lot of light.
Yes. That is, you're saying something that I thought about this. I have a sense that part of my mission at that time as a child was to eat the darkness. I had this idea put into my mind that there was a balance of light and dark here, and it was dangerous the way that it was because it was tilting way too far into the dark. So I don't know if this is true, but this is what the knowing that I had, that I was put in some of the darkest places on the planet, and I sort of ate that darkness and digested it and then like excreted light. So it was a way to reduce some of the darkness on the planet. So as I went along, I felt that that was part of my job. Something else that I really felt very strongly was almost like I was a spy for Source. And so that was another level of it where I have a almost photographic mind. And so I remember everything. It just sort of almost like records. And so all the things that would happen, even when I was drugged or something, I would always seemingly record it all. And then I feel like I was transmitting that information back, like this is what's going on here on this planet. I know that sounds a little weird, but that is the way that it felt to me.
So Max, take us back to, where'd you come from? Where were you born?
I'll just start a step before that. My grandfathers were both in the Foreign Service. If you don't know what that is, it's the people that work in the embassies in other countries, so also called a diplomat. That's what an ambassador is, also works in that area. And so my dad's dad was American, and he was in the American Foreign Service. So my dad happened to be born in Italy and grew up in a bunch of countries. Same thing with my mom's dad, except he's Italian, so he was in the Italian Foreign Service. Uh-huh. My mom happened to be born in Egypt and grew up in a bunch of countries as well. And then the two grandpas, the American one was the American ambassador in Libya, and my Italian one was the general consul. And so my parents were, I don't know, maybe 20 or early 20s, and that's where they met. So they were both there in Libya with their parents, and they met and got married there in Libya. And then my dad became a Marine. So my mom, for the first time ever, moved to the U.S. with my dad, and we lived I was born on a Marine base in Southern California. And shortly thereafter, my dad went to Vietnam, and then a few years later, he also joined the Foreign Service. And so I myself grew up in a bunch of countries as well.
Now, that brings up an interesting point. Max Lowen isn't your original name, correct?
No, it's not. I actually changed my first and last name both. Sometime maybe 15 years ago, I don't remember exactly, but when I finished my therapy, I wanted to start fresh, and so I went to the court and I completely changed my name. And I'm glad right now, too, for this purpose, because I need to tell my story, but I don't really want to expose my family members,
Sure, that makes sense. So living all over the world is fascinating.
Yeah.
Tell us a little about your lifestyle.
Okay, so I had a sort of paradoxical lifestyle. So on the one hand, I lived in very nice homes. I went to private schools. We had a chauffeur take us to school. We didn't take the school bus. My mother was very into appearances, so we had clothing from the finest Italian designers or made from tailors. Hi, birds. Italian clothing. And unfortunately, she liked to match me and my two siblings. So I have a brother and a sister. So, the little matching outfits thing, the beautiful Italian leather shoes. We went to a country club on the weekends, played tennis, rode horses. In the winter, we would go skiing either in the Andes or in the Alps. So, even the meals, we had the silver plate under the china plate and the forks that you have to, eat the salad with the right fork and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of that, and I had to learn a lot of manners also because we would frequently be in the company of politicians or presidents of countries or figures such as that. So there were that at that level, there's a certain way that you're supposed to curtsy and speak. And so I had to go through all that kind of, training. So overall, I would say on that aspect of it, it was a fairly privileged, not the highest class lifestyle, but pretty up there.
So it sounds like because of the work that your uncles and family were involved in, that's what took you around the world. What were some of the countries that you lived in as a child?
So I was born in California, and then I left. That was when my dad was a Marine. We lived on a base in Southern California. And I think I was around a year and change old when he went to Vietnam. And we ended up moving to Chile while he was there. My mom's dad was stationed there as a Foreign Service officer, and so we lived with them. And when my dad came back, we moved to Lesotho, which is a teensy little country inside the country of South Africa. So we had to go out the borders, to Johannesburg or places like that to do grocery shopping and that kind of thing. It was very, very small. They had a king and a queen, which we played sometimes with their kids. And after that, I lived in the Dominican Republic, which is, for people who don't know, it shares an island with Haiti. So it's the other half of the island, but they speak Spanish there. And lived there for a couple of years. After that, we moved to Argentina. So I was in Buenos Aires for 5 years. And when we lived there, it was between like 74 and 78, roughly. And so that was actually the time of the military coup in Argentina. There had been the president Juan Perón, and then his wife Evita, which is famous for a musical. But he had a second wife, Isabelita, who was the president when we lived there. And then the military did a coup. It was a big thing there. There was a lot of tension going on. Americans were in danger. Actually, at that point, my dad had to wear a gun, and we had to have a guard in front of our house and all for a few years. But lived there, beautiful country. And then after that, my high school years in Rome, Italy. So I graduated high school in Italy. And I did go to American schools or international schools in every country that I lived in. So because the idea was that I was always going to come to the United States for university once I turned 18. I am an American citizen. I just didn't grow up in my own country. I came when I was 18. But so some of the schools, for example, my elementary school and middle school in Argentina, it was kind of neat because the first half of the day was in English and the second half of the day was in Spanish. So as you can imagine, I grew up trilingual. My mom doesn't speak English fully. She grew up with Italian and Spanish. My dad grew up with English and Spanish. So he spoke English to us. She spoke Italian to us. They spoke Spanish together. And then, living in so many Spanish-speaking countries and going to school, I am able to speak, read, and write all of them equivalently, which is nice. And I have a bit of French and a bit of German, but I don't consider myself fluent.
So what are, share, if you don't mind, would you share some of the memories you have of just a couple of the most significant places for you where you lived as a child?
I remember Lesotho. If houses have a backyard, this was just land. And I remember, at night you could hear the howls and the shrieks of the monkeys and the animals and everything. And so that was really interesting. And it was very basic. So in front of our house was a dirt road. And we were actually, my mom had always told us never to play outside of the gate around the house, but we did. And I do have a memory of, they used to run herds of oxen there. These big animals with these giant horns, and it was usually a guy on horseback who would ride. And we were playing right outside of the gate, and suddenly I heard this thundering noise, and I look up, and I see this herd just coming straight at me, and the guy in front of them on the horse going, "Get out of the way, get out of the way." But it was kind of too late, and we froze. I mean, I must have been, 4 or 5, and my brother a year younger. And so all of a sudden, my dog, we had a Rhodesian Ridgeback named Fritz. My mom opened the door, he ran, jumped over the fence, and he stood right in front of us and barked. And so the oxen went around him in a V. And so all I remember was this thunderous sound of hooves and all this dust. I couldn't see anything. And then in a moment, it was over. So that dog saved my life. And it's been a pattern throughout my life where, and I've gone through some really brutal things. But what I really want to say is that Source has always had my back. Always. So even in the darkest moments, like in this moment, I could have been, my life was always spared. So that was an interesting experience there. And, it was pretty rough going grocery shopping in Lesotho because of apartheid. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot, the first time we went shopping, there was a lot of issues because our driver wasn't allowed in the whites only store because he was black. And my mom made a scene about that. She didn't like that racism. And so that was an interesting experience for me witnessing that. When we lived in the Dominican Republic, which was next, that island, it was so beautiful. I loved going to the beach and swimming in the ocean. And we had a really great, he was our chauffeur and our gardener, and his name was Martin. And he was so good to us. Like, he taught me how to ride a bike without training wheels, and he taught me how to swim in the ocean. And so it was very warm and tropical there, and pretty buggy. We had tarantulas, about this big, nice big and hairy ones. They called them cacatas there, and they were pretty used to them. So they'd run in and out of our house. We had to sleep with mosquito nets over our bed, and I shared a room with my brother, and most nights he would end up in my bed because when you'd wake up in the morning, there'd be all kinds of things on that mosquito net. And once I did find a tarantula in my bed. So, it had its perks and its downside, but I have fond memories of that place. And in Argentina, it's really beautiful there. The Andes Mountains and the plains and the city, of Buenos Aires, it looks very, very European. Their Independence Day was the same day as my birthday, July 9th. So there are always fireworks. And I enjoyed the nature at the country club there. We would go every weekend, and it was very soothing for me to go into the trees. I would just sit under a tree with my book. And that was a really important solace for me. And then Rome, Italy is Italy. It's
Now, Max, I know this next part is difficult, and thank you for being willing to share some of this with us. So can you tell me a little bit about how early did this begin?
Well, the abuse began actually shortly after birth. My uncle, my mom's, 10 years older brother, was my primary abuser. And he visited the military base after I was born. And what he did was he staged in my room some strobe lights that would flicker on and off, some recordings of different sounds like gongs or screaming or very loud sudden noises. He had my mother tied up to a chair, and the light would kind of go on and off her. He swung me around the room by my arm, and I was a baby. So today I know that to be MK Ultra. It was designed to kind of shatter me and to break the attachment bond between my mother and I. It unfortunately was mostly successful. And my mom became very depressed after my uncle visited and left. And she did struggle with this throughout her life. She would either be very, very depressed and not get out of bed, or she might, I would see it as her eyes would change. That's how I knew it. She could become very violent and unpredictable as well. So she herself was, fairly traumatized. In any case, after he left, she became quite depressed, and I was perhaps a little over one. And I found her in the bathtub. She was lying there with her wrists slit, and she was pregnant with my brother. And I was a very sensitive child, bordering on psychic. And so I could actually feel my brother in there in distress. And I saw the blood, and I knew, whoops, this is not good. And so what I thought to do is I went to the front door of the apartment, and there was a little, the little strip on the bottom of the door, and I heard someone walking out in the hallway. So I stuck my hand and I started patting the ground, and it worked. The person saw that or heard and brought, the guy came with the keys, and they were able to send my mom to a hospital and save her life. At this point, my dad's already gone. He's in Vietnam because he's a Marine. And so after that, we moved to Chile to live with my mom's parents who were stationed there. And she had to be hospitalized in a psych hospital because of, whatever that trauma was. Unfortunately, my uncle visited Chile as well. And I do have a memory of a ritual that he did when I was maybe about 2.5. He told me actually my entire childhood that I was the devil. And so this particular thing was an exorcism. And it took place in a church with my family sitting there. And I remember he put a burning metal cross on my chest right here. I remember the pain and the smell of burning flesh. And the priest, and they chanted some things, and then they put me in a small coffin and left me there overnight. So this would be an example of some of the, whether you call it Satanic Ritual or MK Ultra, but some of the abuse that happened.
Now, your abuse took a lot of different forms.
Yes.
A lot of psychological abuse.
Yes.
You had mentioned being in Argentina and you would have fireworks on your birthday, but that's not all that happened on your birthday.
No. My birthday was a day that was chosen to target me with particularly, extra torture day. And so my birthday's in July, and every Christmas and every summer, no matter what country we lived in, my mom would take us to Rome to visit because her parents lived there and all her siblings and my uncle. And so when I would I was always there during the summer during my birthday. And my uncle had a big mansion and property, and he would have these birthday parties ostensibly for me. There would be clowns and ponies and, everything a kid could want, mounds of presents visible. He would put me in a dog cage in the middle of my own party. So I had to watch everyone having fun and couldn't participate. And then people were instructed if they walked by my cage to spit on me. And then at the end of the birthday party, I had to watch the other kids get my presents. And so there was a lot of torture that was also psychological to break me. Another example of that would be there was an incident where I was given a choice whether to, either my mom would be raped or I would be raped. And he had both of us. And so I would look at my mom and I would see her already gone. And so I would always have to choose to take on the bad thing myself. In the facility, he would put me with a test, like my mom on one side of a desk, me on the other, electric shock, and either I shock her or I get a shock. And so in these kinds of tests, it was kind of a no-brainer for me. I was never going to consent to hurting another person. So I would say no. Some of them, though, were worse in the sense that he would have me choose. He would tell me that there were two people, and I would have to choose which one lived and which one he killed. And if I didn't choose, then he would kill them both. And so it was an untenable choice to have to make that choice, who lives or who dies. I I would do it because I would feel like, well, at least one person's life would be spared. But, as you can imagine, it fairly, destroyed me, and left me with a lot of guilt as well. I felt like that was my uncle doing these things, and he would do them to hurt me. And so it felt, and having to make those impossible choices, there was a lot of guilt that was in me, even though now I know, of course, it wasn't my fault. I did carry a lot of that burden.
You had mentioned a number of things, that it wasn't the psychological abuse was intense, but there was also sexual abuse and
Yes.
other ritual that you were
Yes.
put through.
Yes. There were so many, One of them that I'll share with you is when I was 14, I was put through a ritual where I was taken to an outdoor area. It was at night. It was kind of a forest, I think. And there was a big bonfire. They brought in all these cages full of live animals. And there were a bunch of men, maybe 20 or 50. I was laid on a blanket. I was drugged. And the drug that they gave me, I could feel everything that was happening. I knew everything that was happening. I just couldn't move or scream or physically react in any way. And so my uncle would have me laid down, and then he would be right here next to me, saying all kinds of horrible things to me. And each man would, almost in a line, come up and rape me one by one, the next. And every man that came to rape me, they would throw one of the animals into the fire.
Now, as you'd been going through all of these things, your parents' relationship was also deteriorating. How did that impact you?
Yeah, that was a difficult part of my life. After we lived in Argentina, we came to the States temporarily for a couple of months, and my dad informed me at that point that he was divorcing my mom, and that I was going to go to live with her and my siblings in Rome full time. And by then, I knew what Rome meant, because every Christmas break, every summer break, we went to Rome, and I was exposed to so much torture and sex trafficking and all that. So I begged my dad. I said, please, please. I got on my knees. I cried. I pleaded. And he said, no, you need to buck up. Somebody needs to take care of your mom. And so stop your whining, and, you're going to go and live in Rome. And that was one of the worst moments in my life, because I knew what I was going into, and now my uncle had access to me full time. And, after I was a teenager then, so with all the raping, I did become pregnant twice. And both times he waited until I was about 6 or 7 months pregnant, and then sort of aborted, or sort of got the baby out alive. And then both times I won't go into the details of how that was done, which is too horrific, I feel, to say here, but he brought the babies to me alive and murdered them in front of me.
You had mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the things about Rome was the facility
Yes.
that your uncle had. Tell us
Yes.
a little bit about that.
Yeah, so he began taking me in there starting at a very, very young age, maybe 1-2 years old. It's an underground facility, secret facility. It's kind of a military medical torture kind of thing. Huge, spans maybe a city block, containing experimental rooms, surgical rooms, a morgue, these observation rooms, all kinds of technologies for torture and, experimentation of all kinds. And so he ran this facility. By the way, they have these facilities in every country, hidden somewhere under the ground. And so my uncle was a very powerful person, and he worked very closely with the Italian government, the mafia, and the Vatican. So when he would take me into the facility, he would put me through all manner of torture. And so what I mean by torture are things like electric shock, simulated drowning, waterboarding, being buried alive with dead bodies, being kept in cages without food or water for days at a time, being, beaten, raped, all that, and watching the torture and murder of animals and people as well. In Rome, gypsies are undocumented. And so he would kidnap them, women, children, men, and bring them into the facility to experiment on and torture in a variety of ways. And I think for me, that was really the hardest part, having to watch him harm other people and not being able to do anything about it. It was really difficult. I mentioned that he worked with the Vatican. So the facility is underground, and they had a train that went directly from there to the sub-level underground parts of the Vatican, which I'm not sure if people know that exists, but I was taken to the Vatican a lot, and there in those underground levels, they have these gigantic altars. And there I witnessed satanic rituals of the variety where they would bring in children, babies, toddlers, little children, put them on the altar, cut them open while they were alive. And the altars had these little ridges on the four corners, like these little pockets, and they would put chalices there, and the blood would drip into the chalices. They would drink it. They might eat the organs, pop them out and eat them if the children were very small. And this was a ritual where they were having fun. It was like, for them, it was positive. They were not only, in their belief system, not only ingesting the life force of the children and youth, but also with these kinds of rituals, what it does is they bring in satanic energy. They bring in demonic energy. They bring in the darkness into these rituals. And they do them all over the place. This one happened to be in the basement of the Vatican. But they would also do them in these, they have these parties. And so some of them would be in someone's house inside. And so they would all be there, all these elite people, politicians, presidents, CEOs of big corporations, Hollywood people, priests, popes, all these types would be the customers, I guess you could call it. And so they would have these big parties and bring in the kids. And when I say kids, I mean, babies all the way to teens, because pedophiles have preferences. They have an age preference, gender, race. And so in these parties, they will basically select the kid that they want to rape and then take it to a bedroom and do whatever they will. Sometimes the parties were in places that had these big outdoor areas like woods and acreage. And in those, they would bring the cages in and the kids, and they would either dress us up in some weird costumes or strip us naked and say, run and hide because we're going to hunt you. And so all the kids were terrified, hiding, and we all knew what would happen if we got caught or when we got caught. And at the end of the night, they would always do one of those sacrifices that I just described with at least one of the children. The other experience I had in the Vatican is just being part of the sex trafficking ring. So in case people don't know, the Vatican has one of the biggest child sex trafficking rings on the planet. And so I would be given out to whoever, powerful people, for days at a time. Sometimes it was done through a hotel room. Sometimes I was just given to the person. I was taken to their home. And so that was something, I don't need to say that being, sexually abused is horrible. I think everyone knows that. But for me, the other thing that was really big was I didn't know where I was. I just wanted to go home. I didn't know who these people were. And that was a really difficult part of it for me. And it actually has affected me throughout my life, where it's a lot better today, but I've always had trouble staying in hotel rooms when I travel or when I go visit somebody and stay in their house. I usually don't sleep the first night or two because that panic, that memory sort of comes back. So, those were some of the brutal experiences that I was put through.
When you were talking earlier when we spoke about the Vatican and your early life experience, you mentioned an event that happened at your communion.
Yeah.
That really identified for me the beginnings of what you've indicated was a big piece of what has helped help you preserve yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. There was something in me that I knew they were trying to destroy me. And so I vowed at a very young age that would not succeed, that I was going to keep myself, that little flame of me, in a place where they couldn't take it from me. And so that manifested in a variety of ways. For example, my first communion experience, I was raised Catholic, and before you do your first communion, you need to do your first confession. And so I remember the nun took me in to the priest, and that was one of those moments where it was life or death for me. And I said, no, I have nothing to confess. I'm a child. I have not done anything. I'm not a sinner. If you want sinners, you can talk to the adults around me, but not me. And, they begged me and, just say something, some small sin. And for me, it was a no. There is no way I'm not going to do that. And I won. They let me do the first communion. I've never done a confession at all. And so there were ways that I resisted. And with my uncle, in the early years, I was very loving and open-hearted. And, like I said, I came to this planet and I thought, what is this? And so the open-hearted, loving small child that I was, eventually you can't sustain that in the face of all this. And so I became very defiant, and it was a way to preserve myself. My uncle would tell me a lot that you're just like me, and I'm going to make you just like me. And the more he would say that, the more I was like, oh, no, I will never be like you. And so I became kind of defiant by the time I hit teenage years, to the point that he would, stage some kind of torture ritual. And I would literally tell him, is that all you've got? You're boring. You keep doing the same old stuff over and over. And of course, that would result in, much worse coming at me. But the point was, I was going to preserve that part of myself. I was not going to let him crush me. And it's kind of a weird thing, but I think that's what kept me alive and why I'm here today, because of that part of me.
Now, the next piece of your life was pretty transformational because you were able to break away, and you broke away by coming to America.
Yes. It was always planned for me to come to the United States for university. And so, I'm an American citizen. I just didn't grow up here, but it was always planned that way. And my uncle could have access to me when he could, but he couldn't sort of interfere with those kinds of things. And so I left. I remember my mom took me to the airport. She was, crying, holding on to me. With my mom, it's always had been such a complex relationship. I was really her mother. She tried to commit suicide more times in my life. I sort of took care of her. She was very enmeshed with me. And so I loved my mom, but in that moment, I got on the plane and I had this incredible feeling of freedom. Like I'm getting out of here and I'm never going to come back. And so my main feeling was of a liberation.
So oftentimes when someone's been through severe abuse, and they get free, the reaction is either severe depression and guilt or almost a complete running wild. Which way did you find that you went?
I went wild. I did all the sex, the drugs, the rock and roll. I threw myself into living. You know, I had not really had a chance to ever be a normal child and live. And so that's all I wanted to do. So I partied and I studied and I had friends and I dated and I tried this and that and the other. And I just was full on living my life as loudly and bigly as I could. Yeah.
And as you were going through this, your father gave you another opportunity to resist, didn't he?
Yeah, I started out, you know, after my freshman year. There were a couple of courses that I'd taken that I usually had been a straight A student, and it wasn't the case. You know, maybe a little bit too much partying and all that. And so my dad took that opportunity to tell me that I was not fit for university, that as a woman I really didn't need to get an education. He told me to drop out. He would pay for a typing course. I could become a secretary, get married and have babies and that kind of thing. And so, you know, that defiant part of me that gives the finger gave him the finger. And I said, no, you know, I'm not going to quit school. And he told me he wouldn't pay for it. So he did cut me off financially. I have not had any parental support since I was 19. So, but that defiance kicked in. And he told me, you will never graduate from college. So in my mind, I was definitely going to graduate from college. He also told me I would never be able to go to graduate school. And he when I was a child, he had told me, I don't know if I told you this story, but to take a step back, I was living in Argentina. I'm about 9 years old. There's some cocktail party I'm at, and the vice president was there, and he came to talk to me. And he asked me, you know, what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to be? And I said, oh, when I grow up, I'm going to be a doctor. And my dad was right there, and he said, oh, no. What she means is she's going to marry a doctor when she grows up, right? So my dad told me I couldn't be a doctor. So, of course, I had to become a doctor. So in a weird way, I thank my dad because whatever he told me I couldn't do, I did. So not only did I do college, I did a master's and all on my own, and ever since then have completely supported myself. But in retrospect, again, like I always say, Source always has my back, always gives me exactly what I need. And I needed to learn how to be an independent adult and a person. And mainly I needed to have no one in my family able to control me. I need to have complete freedom. And that's what that gave me. So in the end, it was rough, you know. Admittedly, for about a month, I subsisted on one bag of chips from the vending machine till I earned enough money to eat. But it's okay. The whole thing was worth it. So it's I consider that actually a positive experience.
So what actually attracted you to psychology?
Well, mostly people who go into my field have had troubled backgrounds, so that's no surprise. I was an avid reader as a child. It's kind of one of the things that helped me make it through. I would read everything I could get my hands on. I actually remember in 4th grade when we had just moved to Argentina, that the school had a library. And by the end of 4th grade, I vividly remember the day I went in to check out a book and the librarian said, oh, honey, you've read every book we own. Like, there's nothing you haven't checked out. And I was like, no. So I ended up reading all of my dad's books. I read the complete works of Shakespeare when I was that age. I read the encyclopedia, anything, whatever would get me out of, you know, my reality. And my favorite book was The Chronicles of Narnia. So I would often go into the back of my closet and just hope that the back would open up and I could go into a different world. But when I was maybe 13 or 14, in my extensive reading, I came across Freud. And, you know, to clarify, he's not a great, you know, wasn't a great person in my field. He did a lot of damage. But when I started to read him, it started to make sense. Psychology, what was happening to me, how people chose to react. And so I became very interested. And in that moment, that's when I decided that that is what I was going to pursue in my life. And I did.
you'd gone through all this wildlife. You are now in college to become a psychologist, and you had roommates now,
Yep.
right? So you
Yep.
had a lot more normal life.
Yes. I was able to be a normal person. Like, I don't think most people, knew anything that had happened to me. I was able to laugh and play and have fun. But I was also me, so there were moments when that did come back. So when I was in undergrad, I was living in a house that we rented with a bunch of roommates, and this was in Washington D.C. And when we would walk down the street, there was always this homeless woman with a shopping cart sitting there. So I knew who she was. And one morning, I was awake. My roommates were still upstairs sleeping, and I was eating breakfast, and someone knocked on the door. And when I opened the door, it was her. It was this homeless woman with her shopping cart. And she said she was hungry, and she asked me for food. And so I invited her in. I made her some breakfast. I made her eggs and toast, and she sat at the table, and we had a conversation. And, she was pretty mentally ill. But I could not see someone hungry and not feed them. I don't know how to do that. So we had our moment, and then she, right as she was ready to leave, my roommates came downstairs, and I was just saying goodbye to her, and she left. They got very upset with me for doing that. They did not feel like that was a good choice or safe or whatever, and so they actually kicked me out. So that was, in moments like that, I still felt like, wow, I'm different, and but for the most part, those years were really, really good.
So tell me a little bit about what it was like. I know you had some stories just as you were graduating out of college.
Well, when I graduated, I didn't go to grad school right away. My first job was actually at a psychiatric hospital. They had different, what they called units. Mine, where I worked, was with folks who were schizophrenic and psychotic and, fairly severely mentally ill. I loved it. I loved my clients. There's a way that I see people, and it's hard to explain in words, but I'll give it a shot. It's like I could see they had these like jagged parts, like their mental illness, but I can see through people's stuff and it's like a little golden light in their center that I see. And so I could see the beautiful people that they were. And, their mental illness, it could be scary to some people, but, coming from where I came from, it was not for me at all. And I really enjoyed working with them. They could get very agitated and, go off and become quite violent. And so my role, it was called a psych tech, and then there were nurses who above us. And they would always have some psych techs that were these big, buff, muscular guys, so that when our clients, would sort of have an episode, that they would jump them and contain them and usually inject them with some kind of tranquilizer. After a little while of working there, it became clear to everyone that they would send me in instead. I'm 5'2", not very big person, but somehow I had this something in me that would soothe them. And I think it's because I saw who they really were, and I connected with that part of them. And so I would go in, and, I had no fear either. I'd seen basically the equivalent of the devil. So, they were nothing in comparison. And so I think it's also that I wasn't scared. I didn't consider them other than me. There was a connection there. And so they would send me in when people would get agitated, and I would be able to calm them down, and they didn't need to jump them or medicate them. So that was really powerful for me. And it was a little bit of an odd hospital. It was very psychoanalytic. Mm-hmm. And so they required an hour of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis for each person in the hospital 5 days a week. And this is back in the 80s, and each therapy session was billed at $100 back in the late 80s, which, a lot of money. And so I would observe this on my unit. I would observe the psychiatrist show up and sit next to the client. They had common rooms, And the client would either freak out and think he was Uncle Joe and start, going crazy and have to be sort of sedated, or the person would just ignore them and, talk to themselves, and the psychiatrist would read a paper and then shut it after an hour and leave. So I observed, wait a minute, what's going on? I thought, this is crazy. They can't benefit from therapy at the level they're at, and it's actually causing them harm. And so I remember when I was still fairly new, they would have these hospital-wide meetings. And so I went to, and at the very end, the director said, does anyone have any comments or questions? So, I raised my hand, and I pointed that out. I said, I don't think that it's fair that they're charged $500 a week for therapy that not only doesn't benefit them, but actually seems to really stress them out and cause further issues. And I said, so I don't understand why. I think the hospital policy would be better served with he or she who can benefit from it should have it, and the rest, maybe my population should not. Complete silence in the room, just nothing. And then the director said, thank you for your comment, and the meeting was over. And we went back to the unit, and my nurse was really worried. She's like, oh my God, they're going to fire you. Oh, you spoke. Oh, you shouldn't have said anything. And I began to get a little nervous, and then there was a phone call, and she puts the phone down. She said, the director wants you in his office. So with trepidation, I went over there. Well, it turned out he thanked me for my comments. He said I was right, and that he was in that moment going to change the policy. And he handed me a handwritten check for $2,000 as a bonus, which back in the day was quite a bit of money. And so that was a profoundly healing moment in my life, because in the facility, in my past, at the parties, I always tried to help and could not, And so here was a place where I had agency. Somebody listened to me. They changed something that wasn't right and made it better. So a lot of my career, my work history was itself also my healing.
Now, Max, you also worked with another unusual group during this time.
Yeah, actually, the next place I worked, I was hired to run a batterers program for a county in Virginia, where I lived in the D.C. area. And the woman who hired me, she ran the battered woman side, and she needed someone to do the men's groups, and decided to take a chance on a woman. She had felt like men maybe didn't hold the men accountable. And so I was young, I was in my mid to late 20s. And so the way it was is these guys would get arrested for a domestic violence offense, and they would be given a choice of my program for 6 months or jail. So I would do groups, and right in the first day, I knew I only had 6 months and it wasn't a lot of time. So right in session number 1, I felt all this hostility, of course, from the men, being a female and all. But I would tell them, I'd say, look, let's go around the room, and each of you please give me one example of either the incident that got you arrested or some other time that you were violent. And predictably, people, the guys would say, oh, I didn't, it was her. And I said, look, it's kind of like with addiction. The main symptom is denial, and we have to break through that because I really want to help you guys. And so we're either going to share an example of an act of violence, or if you really don't want to do that, that's okay. I'll call your probation officer, and you can go back to jail. But if you're going to be here, this is the way we're going to start today. And so that broke the ice. And as I worked with them and talked to them, I began, of course, I explored their past. And it was really helpful for me as a woman to hear what men go through in the world. Because from my experience, men were the perpetrators and bad. My dad, the other men, And so it was really powerful for me to see that these guys were victims too. And they would tell me stories like when they were 10 years old and a kid in the neighborhood was bullying them, and they would come back crying, and their dad would say, man up, go out there and fight that person. And, they didn't want to. And so this masculinity training, was so toxic. And so we explored that and talked about that. And, we would do an exercise where I would have whiteboards, and we'd write down all the things that describe a man and a woman. And then I would draw prison bars on it, And we started to talk about sexism and women and men, and they began to see. And so I asked them to bring me examples, and you wouldn't believe the amazing examples these guys would bring. And slowly but surely, things began to happen in those groups. And by the end of the 6 months, they did not want to end. They begged me to continue. So, and I couldn't, because I had to have my next round. But what I did is I encouraged them to keep going and to do men's groups. Because these guys would tell me that in that 6-month group, they had been closer to those other guys and shared more personal information than they ever had before in their life. And so it was such an experience for me. And they, at the end, they loved me. And so something happened healing-wise there too for me, where threatening men became not threatening, and became, we bonded together. And what I was not able to change in my uncle, I was able to affect change in these men, and their lives got better, and their wives would send me flowers, and it was such a beautiful experience. And another facet of that was really interesting is I got to work, so it occurred to me to form liaisons with the court people and the police, because they were all involved with these men. And so I became friends with the police department. I described what I would do in my program. I would go talk to them, and they would give me ride-alongs and show me what they would do, and same with the probation officers. So I learned a lot about the system and the courts and whatnot. But mainly, I loved working with those men. And I did groups both in English and Spanish, so for Hispanic men and, American men. And so that was another, I think, very pivotal work experience for me. After that, I basically worked with teens, so dating violence for a year or two. I worked at a rape crisis center. I worked with abused children, sexually abused children. So and I worked in the jail and in the prison system. So I worked in the jail mental health unit, and I worked in a women's prison doing trauma groups, sort of as a consultant. And so the jail was another, I think, healing experience, because it gave me nightmares. Being in there, it reminded me of the facility. But now I was able to go in and out, and I was able to help people in there, as opposed to have people murdered and tortured and me having, no agency. So when I look at my work history, I feel that it was a part of my healing. After the psych hospital, I went and got my master's. And then after that, I worked for a nonprofit in the inner city. I was kind of more in a social worker role there. I also loved that so much. The population was homeless folks who had an addiction. It was mostly crack. And they had allegedly a mental disorder as well. And so I started working there. It turns out most of my clients were women, homeless women. And I began to understand and notice that they weren't crazy. They were trauma survivors. They were traumatized. And so I started I had this idea to start a group. And everybody told me, no homeless women will come to a group with each other. They don't trust each other. That won't happen. As part of my social worker role in the agency, we managed their money, their disability. And so I thought of giving them their weekly money with coming to the group. And so they would come to the group. And after a few, they wanted to come. So that shifted. And we began to talk about a bunch of things. And I realized, these women, I found something in common. Not that I've ever experienced homelessness, but they too, like me, felt different, outcasted, not part of society. And so I really could feel that. And it occurred to me what they need more is like integration back into society kind of thing. So at the time of my group, I began to do things like the first experiment was taking them to Pizza Hut. Mm-hmm. So ordering, dining out, and it went pretty well until the tip. They really objected to leaving a tip. There were some F-bombs and some other words about, I'm not going to give that blank my extra money. And so I sort of explained to them, that's part of going out. And, so we learned these things together with them little by little. I began to call around. I got a lot of tickets to plays and movies and fancier and fancier restaurants and that kind of thing. And so that's what I began to do with them, to take them to these places and to help them, socialize and understand and feel more and more a part of society. And kind of the icing on the cake there, it was an election year at that point. And so I took them and helped them register to vote. And I took them to vote. And the candidate that they had voted for won. And we watched it together, and their joy, they were whooping and hollering and ah! And for me, it was such a moment of joy because they truly felt that they were part of society in that moment. They had helped elect the next president. So that was just I so enjoyed working there. I mean, there were challenges, to be fair. The women were addicts, so they would relapse. And unfortunately, my agency had a policy of evicting people if they used from the housing. And so one of the things I was able to do there, same way I did it in the psych hospital, is again, during a meeting, I spoke up and I said that I didn't think it was fair or even helpful if they used to have them thrown out of housing, because when you're homeless, I mean, it's a lot harder to stay clean. And so my boss, she liked me, she heard me, so she gave me a shot. She gave me a house, and she said to put some of my clients in there and run it in a different and new way. And so I was really glad for the opportunity. We had them go to NA groups and AA groups and all and such. After about a week of living there, I would go over to check on them. And one such time I went over to check, and oops, I saw a truck with some guys bringing the furniture out of the house and loading it onto the truck. And come to find out, the ladies had sold the furniture for drug money. So, I instructed the men to put it back, and they did. So I narrowly averted a crisis there. But long story short, after that, it did go forward in a really good way. And so because of that, I was actually invited to a conference, and I was able to present the model that I had created for working with addicts while, keeping them in housing. So that was really significant. I also had talked to my boss, the director, about the fact that I felt that these women were not mentally ill, but rather trauma survivors. And so she began to come to my groups and to see that. And as a consequence, she actually sent me and a couple of other people I got the benefit of training with the top trauma people in the United States, paid for, by my agency. And so I got some really good training. And then we actually put together a psychoeducational manual that I co-wrote for how to do trauma groups with this specific population. And so it was a really, again, a place for me where I felt like I'm speaking up about something and finally somebody's listening and changing things and doing something about it. So that was very healing and empowering as well. And it was overall, I loved it. It was a wonderful 5 years that I worked there. There were a few moments, such as one of my clients came to me one day and she told me that she had gotten some crack on a debt, and that the dealer had told her that if she didn't pay up, he was going to break both her legs. So I still had that, defiant sort of part of me. So I told her, take me to him. So she took me to the dealer, and I just remember looking up. He was quite tall. I noticed a gun in his pocket. But I think because of the way I grew up, I was sort of fearless, perhaps foolishly so, but back then that's how I was. And so I confronted him and I said, look, my client tells me that you're going to break her legs unless she pays you the drug debt. But I manage her money, and I can't, of course, pay a drug debt. I'm not allowed to. And so you're going to have to let that go and just never sell her drugs again, because she will not be able to pay you, and tell all the other dealers that, and just let this one go, because obviously if she comes back to me with broken legs, I would be obligated to say who did it. And I know who you are. And, it was a moment of silence. Then he looked at me and he said, "Yes, ma'am."
So Max, your experiences while you were in college and just after was bringing healing, and that led you on to begin searching, didn't it?
Yes. In retrospect, I mean, I see everything that happened to me in my life was there to move me forward and to heal me. Like I said, Source has always had my back and given me just the right experiences that I needed. But I was always kind of searching for something, trying to find myself, trying to find something that I couldn't quite define what it was. And so one of the things I decided to do when I went back to school for my doctorate, I went to a sort of an alternative school. And I was able to study things like shamanism and holotropic breath work and the use of psychedelics and healing and these kinds of things. And so I became interested in shamanism, particularly because unlike Western psychology, they don't divide the mind, the body, and the spirit. They consider it as one. And so that model really appealed to me. So I decided to take myself over to the Amazon jungle. So over the summer, when school wasn't in session, I hopped a plane, I went to Peru, and I went into the Amazon. Getting there is quite the experience. You have to fly to the capital, you have to fly to a border town, you get into these crazily dilapidated taxis, go on all these bumpy roads, get on a boat, go down the Amazon River, which is astonishing. Oh my God, what an incredible part of the world. And the place that I stayed, I lived with a tribe, and they were tributary off the main river, and the area where they lived, that section of the river had a geothermal part to it. So the water there was actually boiling. I mean, steam was coming up, and they had these giant flat rocks in the middle. So the people that lived there, they would actually go hop onto the rocks and take a steam bath. They developed a pulley system with buckets, so they bring up the hot water and use it for washing, and with some lime in it, cooling it down for drinking. It was, perfectly clean. And they had built this beautiful area. And so I stayed with them for a little while, for a few months. And, one of the things I noticed about these folks is they moved very differently than Western people. They were in their bodies in a way, it's almost like they were always dancing. There was this naturalness, this joy that was emanating from them. I kept watching them because I thought, oh my God, it was so obvious and distinct. And they were, very poor. They did not have shoes or even full articles of clothing. But these folks had everything they needed right there in the jungle. And so I stayed with them, and I worked with the shamans. I talked to them, I learned from them, and I did participate in ayahuasca ceremonies. I helped them go pick the plants, boil them. It's a whole process. We did the ceremonies with the drinking. And for me, those ayahuasca experiences did help me. It did bring a lot. I think what it did is all the experiences of my childhood, that happened, to survive, I had to put them all away in drawers. My imagery is like those old library card catalog drawers. So every experience, I would just put it away. And I think when I began to do the ayahuasca ceremonies, I think it sort of unlocked the vault. And so it was another step in my healing because it began to bring up and out some of the things that had been very deeply buried. The other part of being in the jungle that was so special to me and it was the animals. that were there. There was a guy, a native guy, and he was rescued any animals that were injured or in distress, and he had built these beautiful bamboo enclosures, and he nursed them back to health and then would release them. So I got to go there and visit, and I was able to hold a sloth, a teensy black jaguar baby, and some pythons that the shaman wrapped around my neck. And he said, he put my hand over the head and said, "Oh, hold the head because they do bite." I said, "Ah." And the thing was slowly wrapping around one of my thighs. I said, "Yeah, okay, take that off now." They had some monkeys. They had these teeny monkeys, maybe about this big. I've never seen them that small. They call them teacup monkeys. And so some of those. And so I got to see all these beautiful animals and be in their presence. And actually in the river, they have dolphins as well, river dolphins. So I was able to see those. So the whole experience, besides the ayahuasca ceremonies, it was very healing to be in that kind of a natural setting. And there was something that clicked for me, seeing the people and seeing how differently they were. It's as if they had really no trauma in their bodies. And it really made me realize how I carried myself so differently. And so that it was an instrumental part of my healing, in the sense that after that, the stuff that kept bubbling up eventually led me to seek out therapy.
So you did seek out someone to help you directly?
Yes. It happened after my daughter was born. When she was about 4, there was a point where whatever was in me couldn't be contained. And so I was having these ferocious nightmares, waking up sweating and screaming. And so I knew, as a mental health professional, and I had been in therapy before, but I just hadn't quite accessed some of the deeper memories. But I knew what was happening. So I got myself some help. And in the process of my therapy, I came actually to an interesting realization about when I gave birth to my daughter. The birth process took about 26 hours, 4 of them pushing, and she would not come out. And so they had to eventually give me a C-section. And when I looked back on that, what I realized is my body didn't want to let her out because of the experiences I had had with the 2 other babies that had been taken out of me and murdered. And so it's so interesting how we don't remember something, but we do, So there was a way that I didn't want to let that child out because I had this fear that she would also be taken from me. And, she was not, thankfully.
And you also had mentioned that you had struggled during all this time. You had a real struggle with suicidal thoughts. Yes,
that really came up when I began, when I found someone to help me. The way the process happened I think it's very different for different people, but for me, it was as if those drawers I described, everyone started to open, and whatever was in it sort of opened up. And so things were just coming back to me in sometimes in nightmares. They weren't really nightmares, they were memories, sometimes during the day. And so, yes, it was really, really overwhelming, the way that it was coming back. And once I started to tell the story to my therapist and say, this happened, all of a sudden I became very suicidal. It had been actually programmed into me that if I ever told what happened to me, that I should commit suicide. So the program opened up, and it's hard to describe, but it feels like I knew it wasn't really my own voice or my own thoughts, but it's very strong. It was kill yourself, kill yourself, kill yourself. And admittedly, I did, during that therapy, go to the train station a few times, and I stood there and I had this urge, like jump, and then that part of me that gives the finger would give the finger and say, no, I'm not going to. And so it would take me all the way to the platform, but then I would be able to get in the car and go home. So it was pretty difficult to, for a period of time, until I was able to kind of push that program back and reveal everything that had happened to me. It's still in me a little bit. And so that's why I said in the beginning, it's really hard for me to talk about these things. But every time I do, it gets a little bit easier.
Now, you also found some other ways to help you cope and gain control during your recovery. I know that you're a kickboxer.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. I really think everything. We may not think of things as healing for us, but they are. And so during the therapy, when I was remembering all these things and crying and screaming, and not surprisingly, there was a lot of anger in me about what was done to me. And so at some point I recognized it was just sort of coming out. And so I took up boxing. And I loved it. I've actually done it for maybe 15 years now. And in the punching, and I did kickboxing too, and the kicking and getting all that aggression and that anger out, it was really helpful in that way, but it was also empowering. Because trauma survivors, what happens is, you cannot run or you cannot fight. That fight or flight, there's nothing to do. You're trapped in the trauma. And so there's that sense of powerlessness, and you can't do anything with your body. It's being done to, and there's nothing you can do. So there was a way that boxing healed that part of the trauma. Suddenly, I was powerful. I was fighting. And today, I don't do boxing or kickboxing, but I just do like intensive circuit training and working out. And so exercise for me is something that I'm never going to stop doing. I'll be 99 and I'll still be doing it because it keeps me sane. It's part of the therapy, and it's really transformed that powerlessness into agency on a physical level. Because see, trauma affects you in the mind, your thoughts, it affects your physical body, and it affects your soul. So you have to find ways for healing in all these different levels.
Now, was there anything else, do you think it was really key in your recovery?
I would say becoming a parent, having my daughter. Well, first of all, I had her. She wasn't taken from me. And I protected her. I was able to protect her. And she grew up with a loving mother, a loving father, and in safety, in joy. So watching her grow up the way a child should grow up, I think was profoundly healing for me. Not just to see what that would look like, because I didn't have that at all, but to be able to watch my own child have the completely opposite experience that I did. Oh, that took something major off me. And to this day, she's almost 18 and we get along, and she's a great human being. She's an amazing human being. She's the love of my life, and so I feel like just having her is the best thing that I've ever done in my life. And it brings me joy like nothing else.
Well, Max, thank you so much for sitting down and talking to us. Do you have anything you'd like to leave with us?
Yes. What I want to leave is I want to acknowledge that some of my story is very, very dark and difficult to hear, possibly difficult to believe that these things even occur on this planet. But they do. And I really wanted to say at least some of the things that I went through, because millions of children are going through this still today. This didn't just happen to me. This has happened to many, many, many children. Some who are actually never get out. I had portions of my life where I wasn't in that, and there are kids that have only that. And so how do we stop this travesty against the human children on this planet? Well, it has to start with knowing the truth. And I know there's a lot of people that don't know this exists. And I know it's dark and it's difficult to hear, but in order to change this, we have to know it's happening first. And so I have done this interview, especially the part where I talk about my past, because we are all responsible for the children of our planet. And this is a huge problem. And so we need to all come together and do something about it. And the other thing I'll say is, I've shared a story of trauma and of recovery and resilience, because the same thing that has happened to me individually and many other people, I believe has happened collectively to humanity as a whole. over thousands of years, we've been exposed to wars and famines and hunger and poverty and violence of all kinds and rape and sexual abuse. And so as a collective, we have gone through the same kind of trauma, for example, that I've gone through as an individual. And so I'm hoping that if I tell my story, that I can help people see that not only you can come back from whatever happened to you, but all of us as a collective, we can heal. And we can use so many different things for our healing. And we must. We must heal, and we must go forward in a new way, because we're at a point today, I don't think anyone alive here on this planet can argue that we're at a very incredible crisis point. Or it could be a point of opportunity, right? So I want to look at it that way. So let's heal. Let's take personal responsibility for each of ourselves. Go inward, clean out whatever is keeping us from the organically beautiful, powerful beings that we truly are. Do that, come together, and let's create something better here for all of us and for the children, for the future.